Welcome to the Execution is King podcast, where we talk to successful startup founders, investors, and ecosystem builders to uncover insights and best practices for the next generation of great global startups. I'm your host, Joseph Siebert. My co-host today is Rob Weber, managing partner at Great North Ventures. Hey, Rob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I just read this tiny little distillation. It was on this app. I don't want to name drop the app, but it has it's like the Cliff Notes of Cliff Notes. It's like one or two sentences, distillations, and it was talking about OKRs, and it got me thinking about goal setting and everything. And I was wondering if you had any goals for the summer. My goal is I've got to repaint my deck. Yeah, that's my big goal. I think my stretch goal would be to actually make all the plants that I planted in my garden grow.
So I have kids ages 10, 12, and 16, and I'm just such a big believer of entrepreneurship that I know I only have a few more years with my kids, so I'm trying to help them experience entrepreneurship. My 10 and 12-year-old boys are joining us at the Nationals, the biggest trading card conference in the world, which will be in Atlantic City in late June. So I'm bringing my 10 and 12-year-old boys so that they can exhibit with this trading card startup we have and try to sign up users for the app. And, it's supporting this, venture studio company, but the personal goal is really just trying to impress upon my two boys the value of sort of their efforts and being a part of scaling a startup at a young age. And they can relate to it because they're kind of into trading cards. So, but then, outside of that, that one's a little bit work related, but it's more family related. I'm doing father-daughter dance with my daughter. So I'm hoping to be front and center because we're the best at dancing of any of the father-daughter combos. And then the third one is this is every summer for me. I want to catch just a little bit bigger or better fish than I've ever caught in a previous summer. So, early season is like crappies, but then it'll turn into like northerns, bass, walleye, maybe some lake trout in there. So those are my three kind of areas of goals.
So I noticed you didn't use the phraseology for like stretch goals or anything like that. Do you use OKRs? Do you buy into that framework? Or do you use some kind of other framework for setting goals?
What I've always found is you don't have to be so enamored by the process or individual frameworks. There are a lot of leadership frameworks, there are a lot of management frameworks. It's just sort of, do you have one? And then are you able to sort of iterate on it, make sure it works well for you? I don't think there's anything particularly magical about OKRs versus, say, any other management system. Or same thing with you see this sometimes in the startup world with the focus on MVPs and lean startups. And, I was listening to a podcast the other day with former executives of Amazon wrote a book about managing. And they said, be careful about the MVP trap and the lean startup process. Like at Amazon, it took them 2 years to iterate on AWS before they launched it. And the team wanted to put it out. And Bezos and other large tech players started launching, cloud services. But Jeff, felt like he slowed the team down and said, we really need APIs. We need to get these things done. And sometimes, I guess what he said about that MVP was, it's the V part of it that the startups get wrong. The viable, right? You can launch something in 2 weeks, but how really viable? And viable for how big of a market? I think that's really a key is, I love these kind of frameworks, but just don't get trapped in the process for the sake of process. You still got to use your brain at the end of the day, right?
Well, I'm really excited for this episode today because we have a fantastic manager. He was recommended from a previous episode when we interviewed Jonathan Treble of Print With Me, which is now known as With Me, which, full disclosure, that is one of the Great North Ventures portfolio companies from Fund One. Anyway, he recommended this guest and we're really excited to have him on. Orazio Buzza is the founder and CEO of Fooda. Welcome to the podcast, Orazio.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here.
So for our first question today, Orazio, can you walk us through kind of your journey up until the point of starting Fooda? How did you become an entrepreneur?
I was one of those guys that even as a kid, I was always had a side hustle going on. I had, paper routes. For those of you that remember what a paper route was, I sold baseball cards, kind of like a physical version of a precursor to NFTs, right? But I always was doing something on the side, and I started my career at some large companies. One of them was Amoco. Before it was bought by BP, was the largest company in Chicago. But then over time, I realized that I wanted to be closer to the product, and eventually I became the product. I was in the consulting space, primarily doing technology implementations of ERP systems in the late '90s, and then all of a sudden the .com thing hit, and a friend of mine that was a former colleague had gotten funding for a company and said, hey, do you want to join this startup? And I found my home, I found my people. So starting with around 2000 and for the next 22 years here, I've been at various startups over the years, and I've been lucky enough to be part of a bunch of exits. And so I keep kind of going back for more punishment.
Yeah, that's similar to my own journey. After you have a few exits under the belt, it's you're a serial entrepreneur when you just keep going back to the well, right? So tell us more about Fooda. Can you describe kind of the genesis of how you came up with the idea, and tell us more about the business today?
The previous company I was, before Fooda, was a company called Echo Global Logistics here in Chicago. And I was part of the founding team. I was the president of the company at the time, and we were looking to provide additional food options for our employees. We were in a little bit of a food desert here in Chicago where the company was located. And one of our employees had this great idea to start inviting local restaurants in to sell food to our team. And every day a different restaurant would come. And it was a couple day a week program to start. And over the next several years, it was one of the most used perks, I would say, at that company. The company continued to grow. Initially, we had maybe a couple hundred people when the program started. And fast forward about 3 years, the company had about 800 employees. We had gone public the year before, and I was getting ready to transition out of the company. I loved it at Echo, but I was 38 years old, and I thought, if I don't leave here soon, I'm going to die here. And I thought, maybe I've got another startup left in me. And so I started the process of transitioning out of the company, but I'd agreed to a long transition. And as part of that transition, I was still going to management meetings. And one of those meetings, our head of HR came in and said, hey, I want to talk about our food program because the lines are getting too long. Other people that work in our building are walking to our lobby and buying food from the vendors. And I didn't think much of it at the time. Our high-tech solution was to hang a sign that said, if you don't work for Echo, you're not allowed to be here. But then, maybe a week or two later, I was laying in bed thinking what I want to do next. And I thought, what, this is a B2B marketplace company where I can, use some kind of technology and build a marketplace where on one end we have employers that want to provide access to food, and on the other end we'd have restaurants that want access to that different audience. And so put two and two together and decided that was going to be my next venture. I, started the process of working it out. And then a couple months later, Echo came back and said, hey, the transition's good. You're free to do whatever you want. And so I decided to launch Fooda right away, and Echo became our first client, and then is still a client today. So that's how the idea came about. I had nothing to do with it other than I was a customer and I was at the right place at the right time. But at the end of the day, it's a B2B2C marketplace that specializes in food at work, primarily for larger employers. Remember, we don't cook food. Instead, we partner with restaurants who cook, transport, and sell the food to our clients at their client sites. Our target market is larger employers in all kinds of industries. We have a vertical software platform that includes a point of sale system that our restaurant network uses to execute the events. And Fooda acts as a financial clearinghouse and provides a consumer-rich experience that includes mobile ordering, loyalty, and real-time feedback to the consumers. We have various product offerings, based on the size of location. But a key to our offering is that there's high-quality food from a wide range of restaurants that provide food at reasonable prices. It's designed to be used every day. One of the key features is variety. Users get a different restaurant each day. A typical site gets 15 to 20 unique restaurants per month. And, regardless of the company you work at, all employers, they care about recruitment, retention, engagement of their teams. And, since COVID, now they're also thinking about motivating employees that come into the office, more and more, whether it's, the great resignation that we're all hearing about, or the the idea of wanting their teams back and sharing a meal from a physical standpoint. Either way, companies care about, the food component of their office or workplace. And then Fooda's model allows for companies to subsidize all or part of the food, but it's not a requirement to subsidize any at all. In fact, most of our business historically was 100% employee paid. So it could be very economical, depending on, the needs of our client.
For clarification's sake, with your business model of Fooda, are the employers, do they pay any kind of a fee or a subscription for this service? And or do the end customers, who are the employees, do they pay for their meals, or what's the typical business model?
It's a mix. So when Fooda started, it was 100% employee paid. Frankly, companies paying for food wasn't really a thing in Chicago way back in 2011. As employers have been competing more and more for talent, we saw an opportunity. So we started providing programs that had fully subsidized meals. And so, some companies will pay for 100% of the food. And then over time, we built technology that allowed for partial paying. And so now we have a mix. It's all over the board. We have companies at both ends of the spectrum. Overall, our programs are very economical, with the food being representative of what would appeal to a certain site. And so we have an algorithm, we have an AI algorithm that does all the scheduling and the restaurant selection. And so as a site is live, we start to understand more and more the preferences of the people that work there. And so the matching of restaurants and menus to sites is all done by using artificial intelligence and machine learning.
It almost seems like you don't need to have a physical restaurant, right? Have you had any ghost kitchens using Fooda?
Yes. So we partner with all kinds of restaurants. About 50 to 75% of our restaurant partners are local, independent, or local chains, but about 25% are regional or national in size. And a portion of both of those are some ghost kitchen operators. And so whether you're purely a ghost kitchen in the new model sense of the word, where you've got a commissary and you don't have any brick and mortars, or you are a brick and mortar operator that operates a commissary, essentially a ghost kitchen, and you want to service Fooda's business through that location as opposed to a physical store, we've worked with all kinds. So ghost kitchen operators make great partners for us.
So Fooda has about 250 employees or so, is that right?
Yeah, so we've raised about $45 million to date. We are founded in 2011, and we have about 250 employees, and we operate in about 20 cities across the U.S.
I had this experience as an entrepreneur turned professional manager. I sort of say it was like accidental. And I learned a lot, in part by, just reading a lot or, trial and error. But then part of it was bringing on other leaders and managers around me so I could learn from them. But could you talk, maybe we can dive down this rabbit hole a little bit on different leadership and management topics, given your experience. Can you talk a little bit about goal setting and how that works at Fooda?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm, as an individual, I'm very much someone who sets goals and measures against it in all facets of my life. I think, my friends and family and coworkers make fun of me for the way I run my life. It's kind of funny, but at Fooda, one of our values is we set goals and measure everything. If there's no data, then it didn't happen. We literally have that, written on our walls and in various documents around the office. So we do measure just about everything. But when it comes to goals, I like to keep them very short and a list of just a handful of, very key items, generally 3 or 4 items per year max. And then, maybe as you accomplish certain goals, you might replace them. And one of the things that probably makes us a little different as a company is we're very transparent. We literally share our board decks with our entire company every quarter. And as part of that, we share our goals, the same goals that we present to the board, we present to our company. And when you think about transparency, there's a couple things to it. One is that goal sharing not only holds people accountable, but also it's an effective way of getting teams to all move in the same direction. And so it just makes our life as a manager much easier because, that information is getting out there. So that's kind of how I like to think of it. One of the things that we added just this year is that we've now started sharing our department goals to the company as well. So not just our, Fooda level, hey, everyone, this is what we're aiming towards, but each department shares their key goals in front of the entire company in the beginning of the year. So we really believe in it.
That's awesome. That was when I was in my mid-20s, and the company, my brother and I had started out of the dorm rooms. We were at around 50 employees. And in my early 20s, we started to get some negative feedback about how we were managing the business. And it was because we kind of kept key information really guarded, and I didn't really know any better. And then at this point, we brought on an outside CEO to help us just grow the business. And he had a lot of management experience. One of the first things he did was just like you described. He basically coached us to kind of share all the key information about the business really openly in the organization. And it was absolutely, a complete 180 like change in the culture. And we really became more centered around accountability, which was sort of always one of our I would say our most important value. But it was just like we didn't know how to create a structure or a system that would orient around that, that accountability. And I think that's what transparency provides. It's awesome to hear that. I don't think we ever distributed our whole board deck. So that's like a whole nother level.
Yeah. We don't distribute it, but I do present it. I go through slide by slide on a Zoom and in person, depending on, our people in Chicago here. I will tell you, the first time we did it, it was pretty scary, from a sharing of the actual deck. But we've been doing it now for probably about 4 years. And so it's second nature. And if you think about it, public companies do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
They share, a ton of data and still, their businesses are defensible. Their employees are motivated, good news and bad news. They feel, a deeper connection because there's a level of trust that's gained.
Oh, it's an awesome idea. I mean, now everyone's in the room where it happens, so they can't make excuses, right? It's all about accountability. And then I think related to that, people like managers at companies put so much effort into producing good board materials. Like this isn't that much extra work to just present it to your team, right? Because you already have to produce this quarterly anyway for your investors and so forth, right?
Absolutely. It's, I think the whole idea of presenting to a board to begin with, since we're on that topic, whenever it comes up, right, whatever that quarter is and the team is preparing, it's always an effort, right? You have to pause other things that you're doing to do this step of taking a step back, thinking about the big picture, and then putting board materials together. And as time consuming as it is, as a CEO that, my tendency is to be, very involved in the business day to day. It forces me to pause, take a step back and evaluate what's going on and say, hey, what is the big picture? What's going on with the business? What's the tone? What's the messaging? And I find it really healthy, as a manager to be forced to do that once a quarter. And then, you already have the materials, you might as well double dip, right? And get additional use out of it and take the time to present to your team. So you're right. It's getting that second use and it's really beneficial for everybody.
Do you use like the OKR framework? Like we're talking about like KPIs and stuff. Do you use that framework or do you just do you use your own? Is it similar?
Yeah, we use our own. I think there's a couple things, when you think about goals as well as, whether they're stretch goals or budgets, et cetera, and what KPIs do you measure? We do measure a lot. As I mentioned before, we like to have very few goals, but they're written out. So we write them out and, it's the same concept of SMART goals, right? That there's been books written on making sure they're measurable and achievable, et cetera. But I think more importantly, when I think about goals and how they differ from budgets, right? And I see this a lot. I mean, I've made this mistake before and at some point in my career, I was coached, but I think startups, especially earlier stage, you need to separate your budget from your stretch goals. There's no reason why you should, miss a budget by a material amount. Let's just say more than 10 or 15%. If that happens, then you might not have a great handle on your business, right? And especially, we're a later stage company at this point, right? And so we do have, all the mechanisms in place that allow us to do really good forecasting. And so we shouldn't be missing our budgets by that much on the high end or low end, right? Either, beating by a lot or missing by a material amount. If that happens, I think, other than maybe COVID, right, and some existential event that happens, you should be able to nail your budget, relatively closely. On the other hand, people shouldn't use budgets for bonuses and goals, right? For, personal bonuses and goals. That's where the stretch part, comes in. And so there's the table stakes of achieving the budget. And then there's, what are the extra goals that we have documented for each department or each person or the company that allows us to go above and beyond. And so I like to make sure that those are addressed in variable comp plans.
That's really interesting because I don't know a lot about OKRs, but it seems like what you do is you set all of these goals and you're supposed to set ambitious ones, right? Where you set, I think, 3 or 4 goals a quarter, and then they're supposed to be pretty ambitious so that you're not hitting 100%, that you're hitting like 60%. Otherwise, if you're consistently hitting your goals quarter after quarter, then you're not like reaching, right? You're not stretching your capabilities and stuff. But what you've outlined is fantastic because you're hitting what you need to hit, but then at the same time rewarding everything beyond, which is the whole idea of, the OKRs, the whole idea of setting these kind of longer goals is to have people reach to exceed just hitting the budget, right? To actually reach and get these greater achievements. This is a really interesting framework. I think I heard you on a podcast where you talked about your milestone approach to growth and scaling. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we've adopted a concept that we call the milestone-driven plan versus a calendar-driven plan. And so, for example, and how this became a more mature process here is food is a market-based business, right? So we have certain operations that exist in each city that we operate in. And so there's a process of launching a city or launching a market. And so before we started that process of adding markets at a regular clip, we talked to some third parties, other market-based companies like Uber at the time that, was launching cities, once a week or so. And we got some feedback from them and some other companies in regards to how they did it. And what we heard time and time again was, in the first 2 weeks, you do this, in the second 2 weeks, you do this, in the second month, et cetera, right? It was calendar based and time based. So that's what we did. We built a plan based on some of the learnings that was driven by that. And so what you find is, that's what we found, is that that works really well if you have a highly predictable process, but ours was not. Once you introduce, a B2B sales component, a building of a restaurant network, launch calendars at, large enterprise sites, things were a little squishy. And so the other thing that you find is when you have a calendar-based plan is that the team tends to always hit the timeline of the things that are fully within their control, like hiring, but they tend to, be behind, if anything, on things they don't control, like sales and client launches. And so all of a sudden you get, expenses are going up faster than the revenues catching up. And so over time, we try to, think about how we can do a better job of matching those two. Now, the key is that the steps are not linear, but there are dependencies. And so, for example, we put together a revised plan maybe a year after we were doing this, which was more milestone based. In other words, you first had to sign 10 contracts with clients, and then after that, you started to onboard restaurants. And then after a certain number of restaurants are onboarded, then we're actually launching the sites. And so, you could, obviously those steps are not happening independent of one another, but there's these milestones, and you don't hire the replacement team until you get 10 sites launched, right? And so all of a sudden then, the market becomes more profitable earlier. There's more attention given to those dependencies. And so, overall, we found that the process was working much better. And so we continue to use that. What it really says is the milestone plan is more, is a plan that has guardrails. And so as we were coming out of COVID and there were a lot of unknowns, unlike, maybe our business was, leading up to COVID, which was, very predictable, we started to adopt the same model from a budgeting standpoint. And so now we not only use it from a market launch perspective, but we also use it in budgeting. And so, a simple example would be that a certain role doesn't get unlocked to be hired until that department reaches a milestone. It could be revenue driven. It could be based on some other metric that, once something happens, then it unlocks dollars to hire a role. And so if something's ahead of plan, then the roles open up faster. And if something's behind plan, then, it just takes longer for that role to open up. And so it kind of, is the checks and balances or guardrails.
That's so great. It sounds almost gamified. I can imagine it's pretty attractive for the employees once they get a little bit competitive to start reaching these milestones and start pounding them out.
Absolutely. And, with any growth organization, things are always kind of up and to the right, whether it's revenue or other kinds of sales metrics or operating metrics. But, when you have a manager come in and say, hey, I want to hire this role and it's the middle of June, right? Well, you say, well, let's take a look at the plan, because, that role gets unlocked when you hit this metric, and haven't we hit it yet? And so it allows the decision makers to be disciplined as opposed to living in the moment and feeling pressure to do something. Obviously, we break our own rules periodically, and you have to have a feel for the business, right? Like any good manager would. But we try to stick to the plan. And so it's an easy way to think about those decisions in the middle of the year, which is, could be 5, 6, 7 months removed from when you put your plan together.
As both an entrepreneur and an investor in a lot of companies kind of in the middle of the US, one of the cultural things that has really kind of bothered me after spending time in other markets like San Francisco is just the value that equity-based compensation can have in supporting growth companies. Have you had much experience, both in the early stages and then in more of the growth stages? How do you feel equity compensation is it properly utilized, or are there any tips on how to manage equity?
You're referring to stock options?
Yeah, stock options.
Or whatever else. Yeah,
yep.
Of course. So it's actually a really good question because I dealt with it personally. So when I was, at a previous company, and the way a lot of companies do it is for executives is you join a company, you get a big option grant that vests over 3 to 5 years, depending on the company. And as you get towards the tail end of that, you might get some refreshing of shares here and there, but relatively speaking, it's a small component in comparison to that original grant. And so as you get on the tail end of that, it's all about cash comp and because you're fully vested, right? And so I believe that if you're going to use equity effectively, you have to have 2 components to it. One is it needs to be widespread. And so we give options to everyone from an hourly person that works at one of our locations all the way, obviously, to the executive team. The other thing that we do is we do annual granting. And so we have a process where every summer in July, we do a big grant where everyone in the company gets a new stock grant. And they're pretty material. And so it doesn't mean that we have really small grants when someone starts, but relative to that traditional ratio, our initial grant is probably a little smaller, but we communicate to the team that we hire that, hey, you can expect roughly this based on, each year you're here, you're going to get, more of a grant. And so what that creates is a laddering effect where every year you have a bunch of shares vesting. And so, one of the keys as an executive, and I'm a large shareholder, I was, not only the founder, but I put a lot of my own money in to start. As a shareholder, I want to retain our team. And so there is a big incentive to stay at Fooda because at any given time, you are giving up lots of equity, right? And you're giving up more equity into the future. And so it's a tough decision, right? You don't have that scenario that I might have had earlier in my career where, hey, I'm pretty much fully vested. This next new shiny object that is another startup is going to recruit me away. So that's pretty important here at Fooda.
In one of our prior episodes, we spoke with Joe Sriver, who was the first UX hire at Google. And Joe told us after moving from Minnesota to San Francisco that he observed how talent would move in packs around San Francisco and Silicon Valley. And, I think part of this might have been due to stock options, right? Like if you have a group of people who all work together and they vest their shares, there's, that incentive to stay retained at a company kind of starts to go away. And why not go build yourself a nice venture portfolio and go from company to company? So this is really interesting approach. I can't think of too many companies, if ever, that I've seen this approach, but it really solves a big problem of retention that the standard kind of 4 or 5 year vesting plan with all up front, that kind of that really just encourages people to leave after that period, right?
Absolutely. And, I will say that we didn't make that decision lightly. A lot of work went into designing the plan and what the amounts would be. And the way we looked at it is if someone's here, 7 to 10 years, let's say on the longer end, what does that exit look like? And, based on each role or each level, we have a target of what we want to see each person get over time. And so we have a system where they build up to that over time. The other thing is it took a lot of work with our board to agree to put this in place because we're giving out a lot of options. And so I think if you were to compare the size of our option pool in comparison to maybe some other comparable companies, you probably find that it's bigger.
So you've been a part of 2 companies before Fooda where you were one of the first 15 employees and the startup scaled through IPO. How's this informed the way you hire and develop leaders?
So, specifically, regarding hiring, there are a ton of great books out there on hiring, but I like to address, one tangible, I'll call it a tactic that I believe moves the needle for us. So it involves addressing the fit for the first role in the company relative to other characteristics like long-term potential, culture fit, intelligence, work ethic, et cetera. The concept involves addressing if your company can easily promote or move people around the organization. The more flexible you are as a company, then the lower priority you can place on that first role. But if you have flexibility that is limited, then high likelihood of success for the first role is a much bigger priority. So as an example, what we don't do at Food is hire someone based on what we think we might need later on. So it's what do we need now? Not only does the current role matter, but those other characteristics I mentioned earlier. And so we don't create jobs for great people. I meet great people all the time. I love networking, but just because I meet a great person, we're not going to go back and create a job, based on what we think we might need later. We focus on the now. And the reason is that at both those 2 companies that you mentioned that IPO, they were centralized, where Fooda is a market-based business model. And so at companies that are centralized, you can have a general hiring strategy that you just hire, the best and brightest, and they tend to get promoted or rotate through other functional areas over time, based on their skill set, their goals, and the company's needs. The fit for their first job within a company, it wasn't as important at those, other places. Not saying that you don't evaluate that and you're just bringing in miscellaneous people, but there's more flexibility to bring in people that you believe have a high ceiling, and you're like, hey, I'm going to start them here and I'll eventually move them on. Well, what we found here is that it did not work very well because we didn't have that flexibility or as much flexibility. It turns out that people really don't want to move like maybe they used to years ago. And so if you hire someone into a certain market, whether it's a city we operate in or centralized here in Chicago, moving isn't really a thing. Now, obviously, this doesn't pertain to remote work and jobs that are remote. That's more of a recent phenomenon, and that could be helpful. That's more like a centralized where you could work anywhere. But in a lot of jobs at Fooda, they depend on the market you're in. So a lot of our sales and operations jobs, and even some of our managerial jobs, if you're managing a market or a region, you need to be in that city or region. And so we find that first job and the role is really important. And so we make it a requirement that you have to be a great fit for that first job.
I love this approach. I think this is one of the areas, if you're going to create a growth company, you want to create a culture centered around your people growing, right? And I remember in my prior business, I used to draw a field goal post. I'm a big football fan. And I would kind of rank entry-level talent. Everyone had to develop into the first 2 or 3 roles of skills. They were sort of slotted, but then you sort of had this field goal post and you could grow into 2 different tracks. There was the management track and then there was technical proficiency. And you'll notice it wasn't just one track of management. We did not want a company that the only way to grow your career was to become a manager and then an executive. For example, when you're in a technology startup, you also want to value the chief data scientist and the chief architect of your platform. That's a technical track. They don't necessarily need to have a lot of managerial responsibility. And so I think it's super important to clarify the growth opportunities. And then you can kind of, in your one-on-ones with employees, I found it was just really honest. I'd say, what do you want to do? And a lot of people, if you don't communicate that, and I found this field goal post, then everyone thinks the way they grow their career is to become a manager. And there is a significant amount of talented people who are just are not going to be great managers. But you know what? They might be freaking awesome engineers. So why not provide growth opportunity for them too, right? And I don't know. I just found it was almost like a relief sometimes for great example would even be sales. It's not just technical skills. You could have I've seen a lot of people try to promote really awesome salespeople into sales managers. And a lot of times the best sales managers are not the best individual sales contributors, right? So I found this analogy, I don't know, to steal from football, to just kind of just to try to be really direct with people about what their future can look like.
Absolutely. So it's funny. I haven't heard that analogy used before, but I am going to borrow it in the future. I totally agree with it. And I think there's this sentiment that management is sexy and it's easy to get sucked into that. But at a lot of organizations, and including a lot of roles here now and historically, the highest paid people within a certain function were generally not the managers, right? From a cash comp standpoint, we've had engineers that were not in management make more than the leaders of the department. We've had salespeople that make more than the people running that region or that product. And historically, I've seen the same thing. And so, getting back to that topic earlier of equity, I think equity is a bigger driver for management tracks, but cash should be a bigger driver for individual contributor tracks, whether they're technical skills or sales or operations, et cetera. Hitting certain stretch goals, could provide more cash comp than maybe equity.
Mm-hmm. So when your book on management comes out, I've got a couple titles for you: either Buzza on Business or Make Management Unsexy.
I like to make management unsexy.
Wow, that was awesome. You can tell that Joseph went to journalism school, although you wouldn't maybe pick it up off of this episode so far. But before he went to journalism school, he was actually in the food industry. So he's probably if you ever need help with naming or branding and different products for Fooda, you could give Joseph a call.
Nice. I didn't have any food experience before Fooda, but I always just tell my friends I could run the best hot dog stand ever. Nice. And now I believe I've done it.
One of my board members for my last startup, we kind of had the option to pick board members working with we had a private equity fund by a third of our business early on. And they first guy they brought in was I don't even remember the name, but he had this background from some mega conglomerate holding company from the internet 1.0, and he had raised billions of dollars and blown through it all in the dot-com bust. And I was like, he was talking about all these high profile stories of whatever he was doing, blowing all this money. And I was like, nope, he's not our board member. The second guy they introduced us to, this private equity firm, was actually he was an immigrant, political refugee from I think it was Iraq. And he ended up in New York, and he was basically pulled himself up by the bootstraps, as literally his first business was a bagel street vendor. And I had so much respect for him. It was right away, I was like, you are our board member. I mean, I just love stories like that. And he was the only board member who would curse in a board meeting. But it was awesome. It was just something about that, that kind of progression, you can have humble beginnings, right? As an entrepreneur, I think most entrepreneurs have humble beginnings. It's not, I don't know. I've always could relate to that a little bit more. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think whether that's the work ethic that goes along with that profile that you mentioned, the grit, the resiliency. That's where the value is. And whether it's co-founders or board members, investors that just really understand that.
Yeah, I'm really excited to ask you this question, Orazio. We ask everybody who comes on the podcast this question. Actually, we asked Jonathan Treble, and unsurprisingly, after listening to how you develop frameworks and how you manage your team, Jonathan said that, what's the quote from Jonathan? You are the best operator he has ever seen. So I'm excited to turn around and ask you, who do you see executing right now? A startup or an individual? Maybe it's someone flying under the radar, or maybe it's someone we've all heard of. Maybe it's, Elon Musk. Right. But who do you really see performing?
So I'm going to give you one Elon Musk story first, since you brought that name up. So Valor Equity Partners is our largest investor. And I remember early on, I would be sitting in board meetings and they were I believe the first institutional money into Tesla and later SpaceX. And I would get, a comment such as, Elon wouldn't do it that way, Orazio. So I believe it or not, I've had to live up to, Elon as a comp in a weird way, right? I am not Elon. And actually my example of someone who I believe is executing is not Orazio. So just, different styles, different ways of doing things. And so the person that came to mind was, I'd like to give a shout out to John Bauschard at Darwin AI. And so they're an ad tech company based here in Chicago. They have about 70 people. John and his team, they've been heads down executing for about 4 years and bootstrapped a company from the beginning. So John is an accomplished founder with several exits under his belt and gets calls from VCs all the time. He easily could have taken an early investor, but he stayed, true to his plan and they've self-funded the business. And, they kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other each quarter and have built a great business and have a lot of runway. So that's who I'd like to give a shout out to.
Could you give us his phone number? No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. Thanks so much for joining us, Orazio. I'll make sure to link to John Bauschard and Darwin AI in the episode description for everybody. Thanks so much. It's been great having you on.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Orazio.